I never thought grief could be twisted into humiliation, until the day we buried my grandfather. The church was still heavy with incense when the lawyer's voice echoed, "There is no will." My father's lips curled into a cruel smile, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all his life. He leaned toward me and said, almost gleefully, "You won't get a single cent. Your brother will be the next heir." My stomach dropped not because of the money, but because of the way he looked at me like I was disposable, invisible. My brother's smirk only deepened the wound. I wanted to scream, but no words came out. That night, when despair felt unbearable, a knock rattled my door. My mother stood there, her hands trembling as she slipped a sealed envelope into mine. Her whisper burned into my soul, "It's time to tell them who you really are." The day of my grandfather's funeral felt like a storm that never ended. The sky over Boston was a heavy gray, pressing down on the black umbrellas scattered across the cemetery. Raindrops rolled down my face, but I couldn't tell if they were from the sky or from the tears I refused to shed. I wanted to cry for him, for the man who had been my mentor, my safe place, the only one who made me believe I mattered. But the presence of my father and brother turned even my grief into a battlefield. When the final prayers ended, most people left in silence, whispering their condolences. I stood by the casket longer, watching as the earth began to swallow the man who had built our family's name with his own 2 hands. My father, Richard, rested a hand on my brother Ethan's shoulder, already discussing business matters, with guests as if the funeral were a networking event. His smile was polished, his handshake firm, his grief nowhere to be found. Later that evening, we gathered in the downtown office of my grandfather's lawyer. The atmosphere was tense, the room dimly lit by yellow lamps reflecting against dark wood panels. My heart beat painfully as the lawyer shuffled papers with deliberate slowness. For years, my grandfather had promised me that one day, I would carry on his legacy, that honor and integrity would guide me to rebuild the company in his image. I held on to those words like they were a lifeline. The lawyer finally looked up, his glasses sliding down his nose. "I regret to inform you," he said, his tone clinical, "that Mr. Eugene Moore passed without leaving a will. Under the law, the estate falls to his direct heir, his son, Richard Moore." The words echoed in the silence. My father's lips curled into a smirk. He leaned forward, locking eyes with me. His voice was sharp, cold, meant to cut. "You won't get a single cent. Your brother will be the next heir." Ethan chuckled beside him, twirling an expensive pen between his fingers. "Guess I'll need to start looking at yachts," he sneered, his eyes glinting with arrogance. I sat frozen, gripping the edge of my chair until my knuckles turned white. The humiliation burned hotter than the grief. My grandfather's promises, his faith in me, it all felt like a cruel lie in that moment. I wanted to scream, to remind them of the nights I spent at his side, learning, working, believing. But the weight of my father's power pressed me down into silence. All I could do was swallow the pain as my world crumbled around me. The days after the funeral blurred together, as if the world had lost its color. I returned to my small apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with memories I wasn't ready to unpack. Everywhere I looked, I saw pieces of him, my grandfather's handwriting on old notes, the watch he gave me when I graduated college, the photo of us standing proudly in front of the company building. Each item was a reminder of the promise he had made. "Emma, one day you will carry this legacy with honor." But now, that legacy had been ripped away. At the office of Moore, Sons, my grandfather's construction empire, everything had changed overnight. The staff, once warm and welcoming, avoided my gaze. Some looked at me with pity, others with fear, as if speaking to me might cost them their jobs. Richard wasted no time stepping into the role of CEO, strutting through the halls as if he'd built the empire himself. Ethan followed him like a shadow, basking in the glow of newfound power. I was summoned to the boardroom only once, and the memory still makes my stomach turn. My father stood at the head of the table, flanked by executives who nodded at his every word. His voice boomed with false authority. "Emma has no role here anymore," he announced, his tone final. "From this day forward, Ethan will be groomed as the successor. This is family business, and I will not tolerate distractions." The word distraction hit me harder than any insult, To him, I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't family. I was an inconvenience he wanted erased. Ethan smirked, tapping the table with his manicured fingers. Don't take it personally, sis. Some of us are just born for this. The room erupted in polite laughter, and I sat there numb, my throat tight. I wanted to defend myself, to remind them of the contracts I'd closed, the projects I'd overseen, the long nights I'd spent ensuring deadlines were met, but none of it mattered. My father's word was law, and in a single breath, he erased years of sacrifice. That night, I wandered the empty streets of Boston, my heels clicking against the wet pavement. I thought about the last time I'd spoken to my grandfather. He had squeezed my hand, his voice weak but firm. Promise me, Emma, no matter what happens, you'll stand tall. They cannot take your honor unless you give it away. I had promised him. Yet, here I was, stripped of everything he left me, doubting whether I had the strength to keep that vow. For the first time, I truly felt alone. 3 nights after being humiliated at the boardroom, I was sitting in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, when a knock rattled my door. For a moment, I froze. It was nearly midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart pounded as I opened the door, only to find my mother standing there, soaked from the drizzle outside, clutching her purse like it contained the weight of the world. "Mom?" My voice cracked. We hadn't spoken properly in months. She had always kept her head down, quietly orbiting around my father's authority. She slipped inside without waiting for an invitation, her hands trembling. For the first time, I noticed how tired she looked. Dark circles under her eyes, shoulders hunched, as if carrying secrets too heavy to bear. "Emma," she whispered, glancing nervously at the window as though someone might be listening. "We don't have much time." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" She pulled a sealed envelope from her purse and pressed it into my hands. My stomach dropped at the weight of it, thin, yet impossibly heavy. "Mom, what is this?" Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It's time to tell them who you really are." The words sliced through the silence. My fingers shook as I held the envelope, staring at the neat wax seal. My pulse roared in my ears. "What do you mean, who I really am?" I demanded. Her lips trembled, but her voice grew stronger. "Your father has lied for years. He made you believe you were powerless. But you are not. Eugene, your grandfather, made sure of that before he died." I felt dizzy, clutching the envelope to my chest. "You knew?" "I knew enough," she said, her voice breaking. And I stayed quiet because I was afraid of Richard, afraid of what he would do if anyone ever found out. But I can't stay silent anymore. Not when I saw him strip you of everything in front of the entire board. He doesn't get to erase you, Emma. Tears blurred my vision. My mother, the woman who always seemed fragile in Richard's shadow, was now the only person standing between me and complete ruin. She placed both her hands on my shoulders, her grip surprisingly firm. "Inside this envelope are papers Eugene gave me. Proof that you're more than what your father wants the world to believe. Keep it safe, and when the time comes, use it." I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but my throat closed up. All I could do was nod, clutching the envelope as though it were a lifeline. For the first time since my grandfather's death, I felt a spark, small, fragile, but real. A spark of hope. I didn't sleep that night. The envelope sat on my kitchen table, its wax seal gleaming faintly under the yellow light. I circled it like it was alive, as though opening it would change everything I thought I knew. My mother had left in silence, only squeezing my hand before disappearing into the rain. Her words echoed over and over. "It's time to tell them who you really are." At dawn, I couldn't resist any longer. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded the documents inside. The first was a letter, written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. My breath caught. "Emma, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. I never trusted Richard to honor my wishes. You are my true heir, not Ethan, not your father. I left proof of this with your mother, so you could one day defend yourself. Never doubt who you are. You carry my blood, my values, my legacy." Tears blurred the ink as I clutched the paper to my chest. My grandfather had believed in me, until his very last breath. He had prepared for this betrayal, and he had chosen me. Behind the letter was a certified birth record. My eyes widened as I scanned the lines. It wasn't what I expected. It listed my full name, Emma Moore, but under father, the line was blank. Instead, there was a notarized amendment signed years later by Eugene Moore himself, legally recognizing me as his heir and granddaughter by bloodline acknowledgement. I gasped. All these years, Richard had let me believe I was his daughter, his unwanted, invisible child. But the truth was worse and better all at once. He wasn't my father at all. My mother had kept the secret, and my grandfather had stepped forward to ensure I could never be erased. My hands shook violently. Memories came flooding back. Richard's coldness, his refusal to ever call me his little girl, his constant preference for Ethan. Suddenly, it all made sense. I had been the living reminder of a truth he tried to bury. The final page in the envelope was even more damning. A notarized copy of my grandfather's last statement, written separately from any official will. It was brief, but powerful. To Emma, I leave more sons, for she has the integrity to protect what I built. If Richard challenges this, know that my word has always been stronger than his greed. I pressed the document flat against the table, my heart hammering. This wasn't just a hidden truth, it was dynamite. But with the truth came fear. If Richard discovered I had this, he wouldn't just fight me in court. He would try to destroy me, the way he had destroyed anyone who stood in his path. For the first time, I realized my battle wasn't only for an inheritance, it was for survival. The following Sunday, Richard called for a family gathering at the Moore estate. I almost didn't go, but something inside me whispered that it was time. I slipped the envelope into my bag, my grandfather's words burning in my chest like fire. Never doubt who you are. The mansion glowed with chandeliers and crystal glasses, but the air was poison. Richard stood at the center of the room in his tailored navy suit, Ethan lounging beside him like a prince awaiting his crown. A dozen relatives and company board members filled the parlor, murmuring polite compliments and sipping wine. When I entered, the room quieted. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Emma," he said coolly, "I wasn't sure you'd show up." I forced myself to meet his gaze. "Neither was I," he smirked, raising his glass. "We're here to celebrate Ethan's official appointment as Vice President of Moore Sons, a new era for this family." Applause followed, but it felt hollow in my ears. Ethan grinned, soaking in the attention. "Guess I'll have to get used to people calling me sir," he quipped, his eyes sliding toward me with a cruel sparkle. I clenched my fists. "Enough." I stepped forward, my voice steady. "Before you start crowning Ethan, there's something everyone here deserves to know." The chatter stilled. Richard's smile faltered. "This isn't the time, Emma." "No, Dad," I snapped, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "It's exactly the time." I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope. Gasps rippled through the room. "What is that?" Ethan asked, his smirk wavering. "Proof," I said, my voice rising. "Proof that Grandpa never intended for this company to fall into your hands. Proof that he saw me as his heir." Richard's face hardened, the color draining. "Sit down, Emma. You're embarrassing yourself." I opened the letter, my hands trembling but my voice clear as I read aloud. "To Emma, I leave more sons, for she has the integrity to protect what I built." The room exploded with whispers. Some relatives looked at me with shock, others with awe. Richard's jaw clenched so tight, I thought it might snap. "You think a few scraps of paper will change anything?" he barked. "This company is mine by law. You're nothing, Emma. Nothing." His words cut deep, but I refused to flinch. "You've lied long enough. You kept the truth from me, from everyone. But Grandpa knew who I was. He made sure of it." Ethan slammed his glass onto the table. "This is pathetic. You're jealous, that's all. Everyone knows I'm the rightful heir." "No, Ethan," I said softly, almost pitying him. "You've been living in a fantasy built on Dad's lies, and deep down, you know it." Richard lunged toward me, his face red with fury, but Margaret, my mother, rose from her chair and stood between us. For the first time, she defied him. Her voice shook, but her words struck like thunder. "She's telling the truth, Richard. I've kept quiet for too long. But Eugene left those papers with me because he didn't trust you. He wanted Emma to inherit, not you or Ethan. The room fell into stunned silence. Richard's eyes burned with rage, but the whispers among the board members had already shifted. Seeds of doubt were sown, and I knew there was no turning back. For the first time, I wasn't the powerless daughter in Richard's shadow. I was the storm he couldn't contain. The night after the confrontation, I couldn't close my eyes. The echoes of Richard's rage still rang in my ears, but louder than that was the memory of my mother's voice standing firm against him. For the first time, I wasn't alone. Still, I knew my father wouldn't stop. If anything, I had just declared war. The next morning, I reached out to Daniel Carter, a lawyer I'd met years ago at a business conference. Unlike the polished corporate sharks my father surrounded himself with, Daniel had a reputation for being relentless, the kind of man who could drag the truth out of the deepest shadows. He agreed to meet me in a quiet cafe far from the city center. When I slid the envelope across the table, he read each page carefully, his brows furrowed. After a long silence, he said, "Emma, this is powerful, but it's not bulletproof. If your father has already manipulated documents, he'll fight this in court and make you look like a liar. So what do I need?" I asked, my voice tight. "Evidence of tampering," he replied. "If Eugene had a formal will, and it disappeared, then we need to find out who hid it. And if Richard was behind it, we'll need financial trails, witnesses, anything that ties him to the cover-up." The idea of going up against my father in court sent a shiver down my spine, but I nodded. Then we start digging. Days turned into weeks. Daniel began pulling old records, talking to former employees of my grandfather's lawyer. I spent sleepless nights combing through old emails, contracts, and company files, searching for anything out of place. Finally, one of Daniel's contacts, an ex-secretary from the law office, agreed to meet us. Her name was Linda, a timid woman in her 60s. She clutched her purse as though it might protect her from the weight of her confession. "I saw a will," she whispered in the back booth of a diner. "Eugene signed it. It was in Mr. Pierce's safe. Then, after he passed, it was gone. When I asked about it, Richard came to the office. The next day, the safe was empty. My blood ran cold. It was exactly what I had suspected. Richard and Norman Pierce, my grandfather's lawyer, had colluded. We had a lead, but the deeper we dug, the darker things became. One night, after leaving Daniel's office, I noticed a black sedan parked across from my apartment. Its engine idled, but the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. It was still there an hour later when I peeked through the blinds. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. 4 words, scrawled in harsh ink. "Stop before it's too late." My hands trembled as I read it. When I told Daniel, his expression hardened. "This means you're getting close." Richard's scared. "But Emma, you need to be careful. If he's desperate enough to erase a will, he's desperate enough to erase anyone who threatens him." The thought chilled me. For years, I had endured his disdain, his cold dismissals. But now I was beginning to see a side of him far darker than I ever imagined. He wasn't just ruthless, he was dangerous. That night, I packed a bag and stayed with my mother. As I lay awake in her guest room, the note burned in my mind. Richard wanted me silent. But my grandfather's voice echoed louder. "They cannot take your honor unless you give it away." I wasn't ready to give anything away. Not now. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, but to me, it might as well have been a battlefield. Every tick of the clock echoed like a drumbeat in my chest. I clutched the folder of documents Daniel and I had gathered. My grandfather's letter, the certified birth record, Linda's testimony, and proof of Norman Pierce's vanished will. Richard sat across the room, immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit, his silver cufflinks flashing under the lights. His face was stone, but his eyes burned with the fury of a man who thought he could never be challenged. Beside him sat Ethan, fidgeting with his tie, pretending confidence he didn't feel. Norman Pierce adjusted his glasses, his lips thin and colorless. When the judge entered, the chatter fell silent. She was stern, her gaze sharp as she looked down at us. "We are here to hear the case regarding the estate of the late Eugene Moore," she announced. The plaintiff, Emma Moore claims that the original will was concealed or destroyed. Daniel rose. His voice was steady, deliberate. Your Honor, we submit that Richard Moore, with the aid of attorney Norman Pierce, deliberately hid Mr. Eugene Moore's true will in order to seize control of Moore, Sons. We have documents, witnesses, and testimony that prove my client Emma Moore was intended to be the rightful heir. He handed over the envelope. The judge skimmed the contents before nodding. Proceed. Daniel turned to me. Emma, please take the stand. My knees nearly buckled, but I walked forward, swore the oath, and Saturday, the microphone amplified every breath I took. Miss Moore, Daniel began, tell the court what you found. I unfolded my grandfather's letter, my hands trembling but my voice firm. This letter was written in his final days. In it, he states clearly that I am his true heir. He entrusted these papers to my mother because he did not trust Richard. My grandfather believed in fairness, in honor. He did not want this company falling into greedy hands. I held up the birth record. This document recognizes me as Eugene Moore's legal heir. Richard knew about this and tried to bury it. He made me believe I was powerless. But my grandfather made sure the truth would survive. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. I glanced at Richard. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Then Daniel called Linda to testify. She spoke nervously but clearly. I saw the will. Eugene signed it. It was kept in Mr. Pierce's safe. After Eugene died, Richard came to the office. The next day, the will was gone. When I asked, Mr. Pierce told me to stay out of it. The judge's expression hardened. Daniel pressed further. So you are saying you witnessed the original will in that safe? Yes, Linda whispered. And then it disappeared. Gasps filled the room. Norman Pierce shifted in his seat, sweat beading on his forehead. Finally, Richard was called to the stand. He rose, straight-backed, his voice dripping with indignation. This is absurd. Emma is delusional. My father never intended for her to inherit. She was weak, naive, incapable of running a company. The estate came to me by law, and I passed it to my son, Ethan. That is the natural order. I stood abruptly, unable to stay silent. Natural order? My voice shook, but it carried across the room. You mean your order? You hated me because I wasn't yours. You never once called me your daughter. And now you want to erase me entirely, just as you tried to erase my grandfather's will. The room froze. The truth hung in the air, undeniable. The judge raised a hand. Miss Moore, remain calm, but your words will be noted. Daniel slid forward one last piece of evidence. Financial records. Your Honor, Richard withdrew two large sums, 50, 0 and 30, 0 around the time the will vanished, and when threats were made against my client. These transactions have no business justification. We submit they were payments to conceal the will and intimidate witnesses. The judge's eyes flicked to Richard. Do you deny this? Richard's mask cracked. Those funds were for... He faltered. His gaze darted toward Pierce. For private business expenses. But Pierce shifted uncomfortably. I can't comment, he stammered. The silence was deafening. At that moment, my mother rose from the gallery. Your Honor, she said, her voice trembling but strong. I can confirm what Emma has said. Eugene gave me the envelope because he feared Richard would destroy the will. He told me Emma was the heir. The room erupted in whispers. Richard's face turned crimson. Margaret, sit down, he barked, his control unraveling. But the damage was done. The judge struck the gavel sharply. Order. Based on the evidence presented, the letter, the birth record, witness testimony, and financial records, this court finds sufficient cause to open a criminal investigation into Richard Moore and Norman Pierce for fraud and will concealment. Furthermore, the estate of Eugene Moore shall be temporarily frozen until the investigation concludes. And my breath caught. I had done it. I had finally broken his facade. Richard glared at me as the bailiffs moved closer to him and Pierce. His voice was low, venomous. You think you've won, Emma? This isn't over. I stared back, no longer afraid. No, Dad. For you at Island. The gavel struck again, sealing the moment. For the first time, I felt like the ground beneath my feet belonged to me. Weeks after the courtroom erupted in chaos, the dust began to settle. Richard and Norman Pierce faced a full criminal investigation for fraud and concealment. Their power, once so absolute, was crumbling under the weight of their lies. For years, I had lived in their shadow, afraid of their control. Now the world finally saw them for who they truly were. The estate was no longer in limbo. With my grandfather's letter and supporting testimony, the court recognized me as his rightful heir. The moment the ruling came down, I felt a weight lift from my chest. For the first time since his funeral, I could breathe. Sons was mine not as a trophy, not as a pile of wealth, but as the legacy my grandfather had bled for. Walking through the company's headquarters again, I felt the cracked marble floors beneath my heels, saw the walls lined with photographs of past projects, and remembered the nights Grandpa and I pored over blueprints together. His words echoed in my mind. A sturdy building must be built on a foundation of fairness. I wasn't here to celebrate victory. I was here to rebuild what greed had nearly destroyed. Ethan surprised me. One evening, he came to my office, no longer smirking, no longer arrogant. He looked smaller. "Emma," he said quietly. "I was wrong. Dad made me believe I deserved everything, but I see now he used me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to make things right. Please, let me help." I studied him, torn between old wounds and the faint spark of hope that maybe my brother wasn't beyond redemption. I finally nodded. "You'll start at the bottom. No shortcuts. If you want redemption, you'll earn it." He swallowed hard but nodded. "Thank you." Later that night, I stood in the company's lobby, staring at my grandfather's portrait. His steady eyes seemed to meet mine, filled with warmth and pride. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. I thought of my mother, whose courage had broken years of silence, of Ethan, trying to find his way back, and of Richard, now nothing more than a cautionary tale, a man who chose greed over family and lost everything. As I stepped outside, the crisp Boston air filled my lungs. The city lights shimmered like stars, each one a reminder of the future waiting to be built. I whispered into the night, not to the world, but to the man who had believed in me when no one else did. "I'll protect what you left me, Grandpa. Not with fear, not with lies, with honor." And for the first time, I knew he was smiling somewhere above, proud that his legacy had found its rightful guardian.